issues. Thanks very much for inviting me to join this really interesting symposium. So I'm going to talk about seafood nutrients and antiviral immunity. I'm not going to talk about omega-3s, which might be a surprise to some people. So I'm going to introduce you to the immune system, including antiviral defense, say something briefly about why nutrition is important in supporting the immune system. Then I'm going to talk about three specific micronutrients that come from seafood, vitamin D, zinc, and selenium, summarize and conclude. If you want to find out more, this is a review I published a couple of months ago in British Medical Journal, Nutrition, Prevention and Health on nutrition, immunity, and COVID-19. So as you're aware, the immune system is the physiological system that protects you against pathogens in the environment, bacteria, viruses, and so on. It's obvious that a well-functioning immune system is key to providing good defense against pathogens, and that's because people who have compromised or suppressed immune systems are much more at risk of infections. The immune system is extremely sophisticated because it has to deal with a myriad of different types of pathogenic organisms. This sophistication derives from a high variety of cell types and cellular functions, which are shown in the smaller box on the right-hand side. So these are different cells of the immune system. There are actually many subtypes of each of these cells, and they all have their own specialized roles within the immune response. The four general functional features of immunity are to be an exclusion barrier, to recognize pathogens, to identify them either non-specifically or specifically, to eliminate, that is to kill, those things that are recognized as not being healthy, those things that are being harmful, and then to have an immunological memory of those encounters. There's lots of interactions amongst these different immune cell types that I introduced to you, and a well-functioning immune system requires all of these cell types to be functioning optimally and to be interacting well with one another. And a deficiency in any one of these cellular functions actually can result in increased susceptibility to infection. This is true in antiviral immunity, where we have these interactions between many different cell types, resulting in hopefully strong antiviral immunity. But the present pandemic, I think, indicates that there are many people in our societies who are lacking the sufficient strength of antiviral immunity to protect them fully. But of course, I think there are many more people in the society who actually have sufficient immunity to deal with the virus right now. Moving on to nutrition now. Studies over decades have indicated that optimal nutrient supply resulting in good nutrient status in stores supports the immune system, and this enables good defense against pathogens. Conversely, poor nutrient supply, poor status, poor stores impairs immune function, meaning impaired defense against pathogens, more infections, more severe infections, illness, and death. So I want to talk about three important nutrients for supporting antiviral immunity. Vitamin D, of course, perhaps the most important dietary source is fatty fish. Zinc, seafood, I think, are the richest sources of zinc. And selenium, which is often overlooked, where again, seafood are really good sources. So I'll talk about each of these micronutrients in turn. Vitamin D, you'll be aware the active form of vitamin D is 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. Many cells of the immune system have receptors for vitamin D, which means vitamin D controls the function of immune systems, controls immunity, if you like, both antiviral and antibacterial immunity. The other interesting thing is that many cells of the immune system, including dendritic cells on the left-hand side and macrophages, are actually able to produce the active form of vitamin D. So usually we think of the kidney as being the site where the active form of vitamin D is produced, but in fact the immune system can produce its own active vitamin D. And that tells us, I think, that vitamin D is probably pretty important in the immune system. Vitamin D supports the function of many different immune cell types. So this is an association study in about 7,000 middle-aged people in Britain, looking at vitamin D status across the 12 months of the year. In the left-hand side, vitamin D status is shown in the grey bars. So vitamin D is highest in summer, lowest in winter. And then the incidence of respiratory infections in those individuals was tracked over the year. And respiratory infections were highest in winter, lowest in summer. Of course, this is just an association between vitamin D status and respiratory infections, an inverse association. So it's not causal. But if we look within each season, this is shown on the right-hand side, we see that within any season, there's a relationship, an inverse relationship between vitamin D status and respiratory infection. So people have been interested in the ability of vitamin D supplementation to protect against respiratory tract infections. This is a meta-analysis published in 2013 from 12 trials in adults and children using a variety of doses of vitamin D versus placebo for durations of between 7 weeks and 3 years. And what the meta-analysis showed was that in those individuals consuming vitamin D in randomized controlled trials, there was about a 35% reduction in risk of respiratory tract infections compared to placebo. This is a more recent meta-analysis of 25 trials, 11,000 adults and children, again demonstrating when all those trials are aggregated that vitamin D compared to placebo reduces risk of respiratory infections, and this meta-analysis demonstrated that the effects were greatest when vitamin D was given to vitamin D deficient individuals, which I think makes sense. This year, people have been very interested in the relationship between vitamin D and coronavirus infection or severity of COVID-19. So this is an observational study using data from different countries where the country mean vitamin D status was plotted on the left against mortality from COVID-19 and on the right from COVID-19 cases. This again is an inverse association. In other words, when vitamin D status was high, COVID-19 mortality in that country was low. Of course, there could be many other explanations for this association. Just now, real data are coming out from people infected with coronavirus looking at vitamin D levels. So this is in-press data from a German group from a big study where they look for predictors of infection for COVID-19 in the top table and for predictors of hospitalization from COVID-19 in the table at the bottom. Amongst the many things they looked at for prediction of infection, they only identified 4 significant predictors. One was being older than 50, a second was being male, a third was being from low to medium socioeconomic class, and then the fourth was having low vitamin D status, which was roughly speaking about as predictive of having COVID-19 infection as was being aged over 50. And then in the bottom, they looked for predictors of hospitalization. In fact, there was only one significant predictor after statistical adjustment, which was being aged over 50, but having low vitamin D status was almost significantly a predictor after adjustment. It was significant before adjustment. So again, these are just look-sees, but it's suggesting that vitamin D might have a role in protecting against severity of COVID-19. Let's move on to zinc. Zinc has multiple roles in supporting the immune system, T cell function, B cell function, antigen-presenting cell function, and so on. And it's well described that zinc deficiency impairs many aspects of immunity. Now, people have been interested in zinc through supplements and immunity, particularly in older people, for decades now. And these are 2 trials, one from 1981 and one from 2016, which essentially adopted the same design, which is a randomized controlled trial of zinc supplementation in old people looking at immune outcomes. In both of these studies, the individuals had low zinc status, and they both demonstrated immune improvements with zinc supplementation. This is an interesting meta-analysis looking at treating people with severe pneumonia, which is lower respiratory tract infection, treating them with zinc, and the outcome here was mortality. And this meta-analysis of 3 trials showed that zinc supplementation could reduce mortality from pneumonia by about 55%, which I think is pretty impressive. So zinc supports immunity. It could be useful in preventing and treating respiratory tract infections, but zinc has some rather interesting and unique properties with regard to antiviral immunity. So the coronavirus is a single-stranded RNA virus. That is, its genetic material is single-stranded RNA. To produce new viral particles, the virus must, of course, replicate its genetic material, that is, its RNA, and it must make new viral proteins, which are encoded by the viral RNA. The first enzyme in both the pathway of viral protein synthesis and replication of single-stranded viral RNA is catalyzed by an enzyme called RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. And it turns out that zinc is a very potent inhibitor of RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So zinc may have specific antiviral immune actions. Just coincidentally, last year, before coronavirus had even arisen, there was this really nice comprehensive review in Advances of Nutrition on the role of zinc in antiviral immunity. So that's a good read if you want to find out more about these special roles of zinc that could be really important at this time. Finally, I want to talk about selenium. Again, selenium has multiple roles in supporting the immune system, T cell function, antigen-presenting cell function, and so on. There's been a lot of studies of the effect of selenium deficiency on immunity in mice. And these very clearly describe that selenium deficiency impairs immune responses and increases the susceptibility of mice to viral infection. Interestingly, selenium deficiency also permits viruses to mutate, including the influenza virus. And as a result of that, in selenium deficient mice, normally weak viruses can become much more virulent. This is really interesting in the context of viruses like the influenza and coronaviruses. These are data from a human study carried out in the UK, where researchers took selenium deficient individuals and put them in a randomized controlled trial where there were three groups: placebo, 50 micrograms of selenium, and 100 micrograms of selenium. After a period of supplementation, these individuals were vaccinated with the oral poliovirus. What that meant was the researchers could look at the responses of their immune system to the poliovirus vaccine in a test tube. And what they showed, as depicted here, was that the immune cell responses to the poliovirus were improved in those individuals receiving 50 or 100 micrograms of selenium per day compared to those individuals in the placebo group. And for interferon gamma production, and interferon gamma is a very important cytokine in antiviral immunity, the effect of selenium was dose dependent. Because this is an oral vaccine, the poliovirus actually appears in the feces of individuals given the vaccine. But if the virus is cleared by the immune system, less of the virus appears in the feces. In the top part of this slide is data showing that there was less poliovirus appearance in the feces, in other words, better poliovirus clearance in individuals receiving selenium compared to placebo. So in other words, with additional selenium, these individuals were better able to deal with the poliovirus because the poliovirus vaccine is actually a live but attenuated poliovirus. The bottom part of this graph shows some really fascinating data. So what they did was they looked in the feces of these individuals for poliovirus mutants. Those lanes of the gels labeled A are fecal samples from individuals in the placebo group. You see where the normal vaccine sequences are, and you see where the genetic variants or the mutations are. So mutations appeared over the course of a few weeks in individuals in the placebo group who received the vaccine. If you look on the right-hand side, those lanes labeled C, that's fecal material from individuals receiving 100 micrograms of selenium per day. And you see there's very little evidence of viral genetic mutation in those individuals. So in other words, even in humans, selenium seems to prevent viral mutations, just as it does in mice. I think that's fascinating. So again, this year, people have been interested in the relationship between selenium status and COVID-19. So again, this is an association study where the researchers gathered data that was already known on the average selenium status in different cities in China, and they related that to the coronavirus or COVID-19 cure rate. And they showed this positive association between selenium status and cure rate from COVID-19. In other words, in cities where selenium status was better, the cure rate from COVID-19 was also better. Again, an association study. This is very recent data from a large study in Israel, where they looked at selenium status by measuring blood selenium or blood selenoproteins in healthy controls or in people who were infected with COVID-19. Some of those people infected with COVID-19, these were hospitalized people, some of them were discharged from hospital, and some of them died. And the first thing you see is that individuals infected with COVID-19 or with severe COVID-19 have lower selenium status than healthy controls. And in those infected with COVID-19, those who went on to die had lower selenium status than those who were discharged. Again, suggesting perhaps a causal, but certainly an association between low selenium status and poor outcome from COVID-19 infection. So what I've told you is the immune system is central to protection against infection. It's complex, and there are specific ways that it deals with bacteria and specific ways that it deals with viruses. Multiple nutrients, way beyond the nutrients I've talked about today, play important roles in supporting the immune system. These include vitamin D, zinc, and selenium. Vitamin D is important in protecting against respiratory illness, much of which is viral, of course. Zinc seems to have special roles in antiviral immunity. And selenium, I think, is really important and is often overlooked. And I think this role of selenium in mitigating viral mutation could be really important. So my conclusions, I didn't say the first one, but it's always important to emphasize this, that nothing people can eat will actually stop them getting infected. But that if they do get infected, having good immune defense is really vital. And there are several nutrients, including vitamin D, zinc, and selenium, which are all derived from seafood, that are important in supporting the immune system and contributing to antiviral immunity. So seafood is an excellent source of these nutrients, and I think its consumption should be encouraged through healthy eating messages like the ones we heard about in the first two talks today. So I'll finish here, and thank you for your attention.
Phil, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful presentation, and I know that we'll definitely have lots of questions for you.
Okay.
I think will you be able to come back to our?
Oh yeah,
network?
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Okay, so that is 4 to 5 Eastern time, but so we'll be in the room asking you questions.
That's 9 to 10 p.m. for me, by the way.
We'll have a nice hot toddy for you.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. And so everyone, that's